On the line this morning is Kumi Naidoo, President of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. With that, I say good morning, Kumi, and welcome to Pacific Beat.
Thank you so much for having me, Agnes.
Yeah, absolutely. Kumi, I know you have this new book or essay coming out today. Do you feel, though, that Australia is listening?
I think the people of Australia are listening. I think the Indigenous people, the trade unions, young people, and so on, and as opinion polls show, that most Australians, in a big majority, understand that climate change is real. It's happening right now. There's evidence in the Gold Coast. I was just up there myself in Lismore, speaking to people who survived the horrific flooding from a couple of years back, the impact it's already having, and so on. And I think that the Australian government speaks in sort of two voices in a way. On the one hand, what it's doing domestically in terms of South Australia, for example, is about 70% renewable energy. These are all positive things. And we would like to see Australia becoming a renewable energy powerhouse in the world and exporting those technologies and supporting the Pacific neighbors. But the sad reality is that Australia is today a petrostate. That in fact, if you look at which are the three countries in the world, top three countries who export fossil fuels, it's Saudi Arabia, Russia, and Australia. And that's, I think, a somewhat uncomfortable club to be part of.
So then is this fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty in Australia's interest?
It is absolutely in Australia's interest. It's in the interest of Australia's neighbours, and ultimately it's in the interest of everybody in the world. Why? It's very simple. 86% of the cause of what's driving climate change is our dependency on oil, coal, and gas, what we call fossil fuels. That is no debate about that. That's an overwhelming consensus in the scientific community. And in fact, with the exception of Donald Trump, no other political leader, even Putin and the leadership in Saudi Arabia, do not deny that. But how have we been addressing climate change over the 3 decades that the science told us we need to act? Imagine one day you're rushing home from work, rushing to work or school, and you come back home in the evening and you realize that there's some water coming out of your bathroom. As you pass the kitchen, you pick up a mop and you go into the bathroom and you realize that you left the stopper on, and during the day the tap was dripping, and now suddenly you have water coming into the passage. What do you do first? Do you take the mop and start mopping the floor first? Or do you turn off the tap first? Surely we would turn off the tap first. And that's something that we've just not been doing. We have to turn up the tap on 86% of what's driving climate change. Now, can we do it overnight? Absolutely not. But what we need is a fast, fair, and funded transition so that we protect the people of Australia, their children and their children's futures, and we do so for Australia's Pacific neighbours, who are one of the most vulnerable countries in the world, as well as for everybody else in the world.
So, Kumi, how would it work, though? Can I ask what data do you have to help prove that renewable energy is cheaper than fossil fuels?
Oh, right now, every reputable think tank, even the International Energy Association, which is the leading body on this, and all show that there has been a drastic decline in the cost of solar and wind. And also, one of the things that is not factored in when we talk about coal is the amount of water is required, as well as we don't talk about the health costs and the costs then to government to address the huge health implications of people who excavate the coals, as well as those that live in the surrounding of coal generation plants. So it's absolutely in our interest to do it. And the predictions are it's going to continue to get cheaper and cheaper. And that's why we're seeing an explosion of solar and wind energy all across the world, including, by the way, in Australia itself.
So what exactly would this treaty achieve? And I ask that only because would the treaty focus on stopping new fossil fuel projects or just shutting down existing ones?
Excellent question. So let's just take a step back and look at what history teaches us. And the people of Australia played a leadership role in the world in one of the forerunners of the fossil fuel treaty effort, right? Which was the nuclear non-proliferation treaty. And what you saw was pressure from below, where in New Zealand, Aotearoa, Australia, and elsewhere, we saw people from below declaring cities nuclear-free zones and so on, built up momentum that national governments were forced to come around the table and negotiate something that has not been perfect, but certainly has drastically reduced a free-for-all in the proliferation of nuclear weapons. But that is one thing that we draw inspiration from. The second is that one might say, quite understandably, in the current global context where the President of the United States is saying drill, baby, drill, and so on, what chances does something like this have to succeed? So if you take another example, the Landmine Treaty was negotiated by 44 nations completely outside of the UN system. It was called the Ottawa Treaty because it was negotiated in Canada. Then it was brought to the UN and then ratified there by a larger number of countries. Now, with the Landmine Treaty, Russia, China, and the United States did not sign. Okay? But what happened was the social license for the mass production, manufacture, and use of landmines dropped drastically and sadly only came back into vogue after Russia invaded Ukraine. And so right now, we have the Pacific Island nations leading. Virtually every Pacific Island nation is on board, and they are public endorsers, and Vanuatu and Tuvalu in particular led the fight to invite other governments to come on board. And now we have, surprisingly, 3 fossil fuel exporting countries that are driving the process. This is Colombia, Timor-Leste, and Pakistan. We've got real momentum right now because at the COP in Belém in the Amazon late last year, one of the extraordinary things was, even though fossil fuels is 86% of the problem, fossil fuels was not mentioned even as words in the outcome document.
Wow.
And that's been the case for 30 plus years of negotiation, with the exception of one time 2 years ago where we succeeded to get fossil fuels mentioned, but in a very weak sort of language. So the fact that President Lula in his opening called for a fossil fuel phase out, and then nothing happened, even though many countries were pushing for it, then the conclusion in the concluding plenary, the president of the COP then elevated a conference that we had been planning with the Colombian government's leadership, Netherlands, and the Pacific Island states represented via Tuvalu for an international just transition away from fossil fuels conference. And this, we hope, will lay the foundations for the negotiations towards a treaty to start. Mm-hmm. And the treaty does not exist. It will be what the nations that are the most ambitious, those that respect what the science is saying, and those that know they must act with moral courage, they will start. There's a Kevin Costner movie from the 1980s called Field of Dreams that tagline was, if you build it, they will come. And once the negotiations start, I guarantee you that countries who have been, and by the way, in addition to the close to 20 countries that have publicly endorsed, we got a further 20 countries who are observing the process on the verge of joining. So if you look at it, we're not that far away from having the equivalent number of countries that negotiated the Landmine Treaty.
We were talking about the upcoming COP31. I know this is all linked together. Looking at your essay, do you feel like it's a bit of a slap in the face? Because I know that you've stated that Australia needs to be a courageous ally to the Pacific. What then did you really mean by that?
You can't take comfort from exporting the third largest amount of fossil fuels outside of your boundaries and then saying, well, it's not our problem. Somebody somewhere else is going to emit it. That's not how the climate challenge works. irrespective of where it is emitted, we all suffer. Look at the vulnerability that the Pacific Island people face already. When I was there in July 2015, I learned a very painful slogan. People in the Pacific were chanting 1.5 to stay alive. 1.5 to stay alive. And for any of your listeners who don't know what the reference to it is, the science has been telling us for decades now that we need to keep warming below 1.5 degrees since the start of the Industrial Revolution, or since we started burning fossil fuels. And we are now hitting 1.5 already. And 6 months later, when I met the same folks in the Paris climate negotiations in 2015, December, I was going to chant that same slogan when they invited me to speak at a meeting. And they said, no, the slogan has changed. And the new slogan was 1.5, we might survive. 1.5, we might survive. So when you got a country like Kiribati, for example, right, which has already had to explore a lease agreement with Fiji for the entire relocation of people, how can we not act with greater urgency? When you got people in Pacific Island states which are being told that they will eventually be overrun by a rising ocean, and the people there are saying, but even if we are taken to the most palatial part of the world, our identity, our ancestors are buried here. I've been to Vanuatu, Fiji, and Kiribati, and I've met people from almost all Pacific Island states. I've been very privileged by those engagements, and I can tell you, these are amongst the most resilient, courageous, creative people I've met anywhere in the world. And I appeal to the Australian government. They have to go beyond simply saying all of what they will agree with everything that I've said, and I'm happy for that. But they need to match their words with action. And that action has to be not licensing any new fossil fuel projects in Australia, looking at how they can phase down on what makes economic sense, what makes scientific sense. We are sometimes portrayed as being unrealistic and are saying that everything should be shut down tomorrow. No, we are saying what we need is a plan that is not what happens at COPs. We go to the COPs and we plead for what are called fab deals, not fabulous deals, but fair, F, A, ambitious, B, binding. Fair, ambitious, and binding. And sadly, every year what we get are FLAB outcomes, FLAB, full of loopholes, and I'll leave it to your listeners to decide what B stands for.
Right. Well, look, Kumi, that is all the time that we have for this morning, but really appreciate you coming on the show and sharing with us this morning.
Thank you so much, Agnes, for having us on.
No worries. That is Kumi Naidoo, President of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, and book there, What We Owe the Water, a call for a fossil fuel treaty released today.